Hello and welcome to the course Basics of Experimental Design for Cognitive Psychology. I am Dr. Arak Verma from the Department of Cognitive Science at IIT Kanpur. We are in the final lecture of week 5 where we initially started a discussion about different kinds of experimental designs, and then in the last lecture we sort of turned our attention towards minimizing error and increasing the validity and reliability of our experimental measures. In today's lecture, I will talk about validity. Now, if you remember, we saw in the previous lecture that our measurements, whatever we are measuring through our scales or through our experiments, are basically having two error components. First is the random error component, which can be taken care of by taking several measurements, by taking care of by comparing correlations between the first half and the second half. So we talked about test retest reliability, we talked about split half reliability, and we talked about a bunch of other things, but we also talked about systematic error. Now, systematic error is when you are not sure that if there are any other conceptual variables at play which are bringing a systematic variance or bringing a systematic error component in your actual measurement. That can be taken care of by talking about or by addressing construct validity in our measurements. In today's lecture, we will discuss about construct validity. So, if the researchers are trying to, let's take an example. If the researchers are trying to measure the speed with which a group of research participants can tie their shoes, and then we find, and we do this again and again, we do this several times, we will find that okay, there is a reliable estimate of the time that they will take in tying their shoelaces. So it will be a reliable estimate. But suppose we say that okay, this time that they are taking in tying their shoelaces is indicative of, let us say, their intelligence, or is indicative of their self-esteem, then it is pretty clear that we are actually making a wrong assumption. So sometimes it is possible that the measured variable or that the measured version of a conceptual variable that we have taken, remember we have talked about operational definitions. Sometimes it is possible that the operational definition that we have adopted and how we have converted a conceptual variable to a measured variable is not adequate, it is not appropriate. So what can happen is we will basically not be really, so our measurement is not measuring the thing that it is designed to measure. Suppose you want to measure aggression, or suppose you want to measure anxiety. Now, if you want to measure aggression, I don't think it's a great idea to measure the number of times a person smiles and basically tell that this is a measurement of aggression. Or say, for example, if you want to talk about anxiety, I think the number of times the person feels nervous and some of these biophysiological measures will probably do a better job than basically saying how many times a person really asks for something else. Okay, so the correct measure or the correct assessment of a conceptual variable is extremely important, and a lot of times we find that people are you choose dependent measures that are not correctly assessing the conceptual variable in question. That is when there is a threat to what is called construct validity. Okay. So, in addition to being reliable, useful measured variables must also have what is called construct validity. They must measure the actual conceptual variable that it is designed to assess. Any measure only has construct validity if it measures exactly what it is supposed to. So, for example, if you are using, if you have a thermometer and a thermometer, you are using it to measure temperature, if it is actually measuring temperature reliably over a period of time, it has reliability, it is a reliable measure. But suppose you are using the thermometer to measure somebody else's weight, obviously it is not going to have construct validity. There are various ways of discussing, there are various ways of assessment of construct validity. Let us talk about them. First is face validity. Now, in some cases it can happen that the researchers gain an initial indication of the likely construct validity of a measured variable by examining it subjectively. As I was just giving examples, if you're trying to measure, anxiety by the number of times a person smiles, or if you're trying to measure aggression by the number of times a person laughs, that is not, you subjectively know that the measure is flawed. It is not going to actually measure the conceptual variable that you want it to measure. Okay, so a lot of times what happens is that researchers, when they are designing their experiment, when they are deciding upon which dependent measures to use, they can actually evaluate it intuitively or on the basis of previous literature, and can determine which of the dependent measures have face validity, which of the dependent measures are likely to be the best estimate, likely to give the best estimate for the conceptual measurement or for the conceptual variable that is in question. For example, we were talking about in the previous lecture of the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, the example that Stanger has taken. The Rosenberg self-esteem scale has face validity because the items, let's read one, I feel that I have a number of good qualities, or I am able to do things as well as other people. They intuitively, you get a sense of that, yes, they are measuring how good a person feels about himself or herself, and intuitively you know that these items are measuring self-esteem. All right, so that, in that sense, these items are said to have face validity. You know that these items are approximately measuring the same thing that you want them to measure. However, if one carefully, so the same example we were talking about, if one carefully ties, times how long the person and some others take to tie their shoelaces, and then we claim that, oh, this is a good measure of self-esteem, then you already know, you at the outset you know that this is not going to be a good measure of self-esteem or for intelligence, or of intelligence for that matter. Now, while it is possible that in some cases, face validity can be a useful measure of whether a test is actually assessing what it is supposed to, face validity is not always necessarily, and it's not always desirable in a test. Sometimes there are other methods also. Look at this. Assume, or let's look at how students of an American university might answer the following measures of racial prejudice. So the item is, I do not like African Americans, and the scale is strongly disagree 1 and strongly disagree 6. So 1 to 6 you have to answer. Similar item is, African Americans are inferior to whites. You have strongly disagree on one side at the 1, and you strongly agree on 6. Okay. Now, if you want to sort of look at that, okay, whether these items are actually measuring racial prejudice or not, you might say, yes, it is probably it is probable that these items, if people are responding to them, will yield a high degree of face validity. Intuitively they seem to do the job, but the thing is, people will not respond to these items naturally. People will become reactive, they will become conscious, and they will want to project. Now, I mean, see, because it is not socially appropriate to come out like that, it is not socially appropriate to discuss these things. That is why even those people who are actually racists will not indicate agreement with these items. Okay, especially if the test is non-anonymous, especially if the test can be used and held up against them, people in these kinds of items will actually not give. So in that sense, you need to sort of have items which are measuring these things in a concealed manner. So face validity or highly intuitive measures are not always the best assessment of the validity, assessment of the construct validity of an item or a scale, or even in experiments, for example. Now, in cases where the test is likely to produce reactivity, it can sometimes be the case that tests with low face validity may be actually more valid, because the respondents will not know what is being tested and thus will be more likely to answer honestly. Okay. Essentially, not all measures that appear face valid are actually found to have high construct validity. Okay. So face validity is something that you objectively look at, but if you think that this will in some sense let the participants know what the test is about, then you don't use those items, you basically conceal them in a different manner. In those cases, we sort of look to assess validity of a slightly different kind. I mean, we basically used to assess construct validity through a different method, through what is called content validity. What is content validity? It refers to the degree of which, to which the measured variable actually appears to have adequately sampled from the potential domain of questions that are related to the conceptual variable of interest. Suppose you wanted to measure intelligence now, or say you want to measure mathematical aptitude, and in the test of mathematical aptitude you have only selected items that are geometry questions, but there are no algebra questions, there are no other kinds of questions, and so on. Now, in that sense, the measure that you are going to get is only can only be treated good as a geometry test, but not of full mathematical aptitude. Maybe there are no calculus questions, there are no differentiation integration questions, and so on. So in that sense, you can say that these items, the ones that you've created, can be potentially used with high reliability and validity for a geometry only or geometry specific test, but cannot be used on a broad range to talk about mathematical aptitude. Now, there are also other related concepts such as convergent and discriminant validity. Let us talk about them. Now, while face and content validity can obviously be used when you are initially developing a test, they are relatively subjective, both of these, and thus there are slightly limited methods for evaluating the construct validity of the desired conceptual variables. Okay. So, also the determination of validity of a measure must be made not on the basis of subjective judgments, but on the basis of relevant data. So, now we move away from whether this is a good test or not by intuition to actually looking at data and deciding whether something is actually valid or not. Okay. So, the logic here is very simple. The logic is that empirically testing the construct validity of the measure can be done through comparing the various or different operationalizations of a given variable. The idea is, let us say if you are trying to measure a given variable, let us say you are trying to measure anxiety, or let us say you are trying to measure aggression. Now, you have one operational definition, you have measured anxiety in a particular way, let us say you have a scale A. There are obviously others who have also developed similar scales. There are previously established scales as well that are there. Now, an interesting way or a good way to actually determine the reliability and validity of your scale will be to compare the scores on this scale with previously established valid scales. Okay. So, and there can be any number of measured variables for a given conceptual variable. If you want to, if your measured variable corresponds to these other measurements, then I think it gives you a better chance of creating a construct valid, a measure that has construct validity. So, if a given variable is, if a given measured variable x is really measuring the conceptual variable, let us say capital X, something like that. So, if for example, if the measured variable is the number of times a person shouts, and it is really measuring the conceptual variable aggression, then it should correlate with all other measures, all other measured variables that are designed to assess this capital X or this aggression. So, other measures, say for example, the number of times a person shouts, the number of times a person let us say abuses, the number of times a person throws things here and there, all of these things should correlate with each other. Okay. So, then if it is really measuring, it should not correlate with, it should all correlate together, and it should not correlate with other measures that are, let us say, designed to assess timidity for that matter, or it is designed to assess pleasantness of a individual's personality. Okay. According to this logic, construct validity can have two types. First is convergent validity, basically the extent to which a measured variable is found to be related to other measured variables which are designed to measure the same conceptual variable. As I said, if you have one operational definition of aggression and there are other available, then the measure will have construct validity when your measure correlates positively with the other measured variables as well. That is called convergent validity. The other kind is discriminant validity. What is discriminant validity? The extent to which this measured variable is found to be unrelated. So, for example, if you see that aggression and timidity are on two ends of the same continuum, so technically your items should correlate highly with all other items that are measuring aggression, but should not correlate at all with any item that is measuring timidity. So, that is called discriminant validity. in both of these cases, if say for example you have you have different measures, all of which are highly correlated with each other, you have what is called convergent validity, and you have two separate measures which are measuring orthogonally different things, different aspects of different conceptual variables, and they are not correlating with each other, also tells you that your measure has good or high construct validity. There is also this concept of the nomological net. So, for example, while convergent and discriminant validity are frequently assessed through the correlation of scores on a self-report measure, just like let us say a Likert scale of anxiety or racial prejudice, anything like that, with scores on another self-report measure, construct validity can also be evaluated using other types of measured variables, something that I was just saying. So, when you are testing a self-report measure of anxiety, it is possible that a researcher will compare these scores to the ratings of anxiety made by trained psychotherapists or other kinds of behavioral measures such as blood pressure, skin conductance, things like that. Now, if you have different measured variables for the same conceptual variable, it is possible, and if you're looking at it across a large number of studies and so on, they will form a complicated pattern called a nomological net. So, once the researchers have looked across several studies and they have used several different measured variables for this same conceptual variable, let us say aggression, and they have related these measures to each other, then a complete picture starts to emerge. Okay. So, this complete picture gives you the best idea of the construct validity of a given measure in relation to all other measures, and the greater the number of predicted relationships that that you can have and that are confirmed, the greater will be the construct validity of any given measure in this overall network. So, for example, let us say you want to measure anxiety. Now, there are several measures of anxiety possible, there are several scales of anxiety possible. The idea is that each of these scales, so for example, you can have physiological measures, you can have behavioral measures, reaction times and those kinds of things, you can have survey kind of measures, and you can have something else as well. Okay, you can let us say have a interview kind of thing, and based on, and you are asking questions about how anxious the person feels. Ideally, what should emerge is that each of these measures, because they are all talking about the same conceptual variable, should be related to each other and should be talking about the same thing. If they are talking about the same thing, if they are sort of measuring the same conceptual variable, they will appear to be all parts of that same nomological net, which are telling us and which are each giving us the best construct validity. They are basically establishing each other's construct validity in the way of measuring this particular conceptual variable. There is also something called criterion validity. Now, sometimes what can happen is that you have one measure and you are basically comparing this measure with the other one. Okay. Now, if you are doing that, when the validity is being assessed through the correlation, let us say, of a self-report measure with a behaviorally measured variable, let us say reaction times on a particular test, then the behavioral measure will be called the criterion variable, and the correlation will give you the assessment of this of the criterion validity of the self-report measure when you are comparing that. Criterion validity can also be referred to as predictive validity when it involves, let us say, attempts to predict relationships, predict what is going to happen in the future. For example, this is very apparent in an instance when an industrial psychologist is using a measure of job aptitude to predict how well a prospective employee will perform across different kinds of company tasks. Or let us say when an educational psychologist is trying to predict school performance on the basis of tests like the GRE, the SAT and the TOEFL, etc. Criterion validity can also be referred to as concurrent validity when there are two measures or more measures are taken at the same time and how they are related to each other. So, in some cases, criterion validity may even involve the use of self-report measures to predict behaviors that have occurred prior to the completion of the scale. So, you will get some estimate about this. Now, while we can use this practice of correlating a self-report measure with a behavioral criterion variable to learn about the construct validity of this measured variable, in some cases, like in some applied research settings, it is only the ability of a given method to predict something that is going to happen in the future is of interest. So, for example, a validity of an instrument can be considered only to be as good as its predictions about the future. For example, if an employer wants to predict whether a person will be an effective manager, he will be happy to use any self-report measure that is effective in making these predictions. They will not really care about the fact that whether it has this kind of validity, whether it measures intelligence, whether it measures social skills, diligence, or something else entirely. As long as the measure is validly and correctly predicting whatever the variable of interest is, a lot of times that kind of measure of validity is also preferred. Okay, so in such cases, criterion validity involves only the correlation between the variables rather than the use of variables to make inferences about construct validity. You basically just are interested in how is this particular measure predicting future performance, and that is the only item of interest. So, we have talked about in the two lectures, we have talked about reliability, different forms of reliability, and we have talked about construct validity, different forms of construct validity. Now, let us try and talk about how to enhance these for your different experiments, for your scales and so on. One of the better ideas is to basically use pilot testing. So, for example, if you are developing a scale or if you are constructing an experiment, it is always a good idea to have pilot tests. For example, with regards to scales, a lot of times you will see is that people who are interested in developing scales will go on with a larger number of items that they originally intend to have in the scale. For example, I want to make a scale measuring language proficiency with just 40 items. But in the first run, what I will do is I will go ahead with not just 40 items, but maybe 120 items, maybe 180 items, and then basically what I will do is I will use the reliability and validity. I will calculate the reliability and validity of each of the items. I will basically talk to my participants. I will ask them how do they think that these items are performing, and during a bunch of iterations I will try and get the best estimate of both reliability of my measure and the validity of my measure, and that will basically help me to sort of scaffold and develop my test in the best manner. The same thing is done for experiments, because a lot of time when we are setting up experiments, it is advised, and we tell the students a lot of times, that you do your pilot, you see whether everything is working fine, if the data is being recorded correctly, if the manipulations are actually working, if the participants are being able to perform nicely. You do all of that, and that basically will give you the idea that whether the experiment you have designed is actually yielding the correct kind of measures that you are looking for. This is not confusing with cherry picking and only doing things that confirm your hypothesis, but the idea is that the procedure should be clean, and at least whatever you are intending, the manipulation, the way you are intending it, is actually manifesting in your design. The other thing is, when you are talking about measures, conceptual variables, and getting an estimate of these conceptual variables, just as we were talking about, let us say, aggression, or we were talking about anxiety, it is always a good idea when you have complex behavioral variables as a subject of your study, is to use multiple measures and then basically arrive at a convergent estimate of whatever you want to measure. Say for example, you are interested in measuring anxiety, it's a great idea to be able to have different measures. You can have a physiological measure, you can have a reaction time behavioral kind of a measure, you can have a survey based method of the same participant across a period of time, and then see together how well these different measures are estimating your conceptual variable, and they will together be able to give you the best estimate of, let us say, anxiety in your participant. So, using multiple measures is also an extremely important methodological choice. Also, ensuring variability within the used measure. Say for example, you do not want to use just the same kind of items in all your scales. Your scale should contain items that are attacking, that are trying to assess different types of different aspects of the conceptual variable that you are attacking, because in that sense the scale will have varied ways, it will have different angles of approaching that conceptual variable, and together it will be able to when you sort of average over items, it will be able to give you the best estimate of your conceptual variable. Obviously, create good items. As I said, when you want to create a scale with 40 items, it's a great idea to start with 120 or 160 items and then sort of arrive at a list where you have smaller number of items with higher reliability. Encourage, instructions should be very good, very clear and unambiguous for your participants. You should encourage sincere responding among participants. Also, items should be used in such a way that they are non-reactive. The respondents should not be able to judge, should not be able to guess what the experiment is for or what a given item is trying to judge. And in that sense, if participants are conscious and if they are in that guessing game of, oh, what is the experimenter, what is that the experimenter wants and I should respond accordingly, then it's not great for your experiment, it's not great for your survey. So typically, you should take all the care possible that your items are non-reactive. In that sense, face validity is not a great thing to go by, because a lot of times when you are trying to create face valid sort of items, they will give away the purpose of the experiment originally. Also, yes, so that's what I was saying. So consider face and content validity as well. And finally, the idea is to use existing measures with established reliability. So a lot of times what people do is they want to measure something, they want to create a test for something. They will just start with the, they'll start with, try to start with scratch, and they'll say, oh, I will develop my own measure. As researchers, I think even in my personal experience, it is always a great idea to use already established methods, the methods that have been used in the past. They have been standardized, they have been normed, they have established scores for reliability and validity across different kinds of participants, and using them is always a great idea. Now, suppose you are, you discovered that there is a flaw or there is a gap in the extent measures, then use that as convergent method, or use them to provide concurrent validity. That will give you a better estimate of the thing that you are developing. Okay. So, while it is advisable more often than not to use the existing measures which have established reliability and validity scores, it is also, if you really need to develop your own scale, then also I think leaning back on the existing measures of whatever conceptual variable you are interested in as sources of convergent validity, as sources of concurrent validity, to evaluate how reliable and valid your given scale is. So, I will stop here. This is all about reliability and validity that I wanted to talk about. I will also need to talk about a couple of other aspects of validity, which I will take up in the next week. Thank you.